Hi guys, I'm Corrie. Welcome back to my studio. Today I'm going to talk to you about floral wire. Let's do it. Of course, floral wire is mostly used by floral designers and florists. They're going to be using it to strengthen a stem of a flower that maybe has a thin stem, or they're going to be using it to assemble different things together, or to wrap Oasis, which is the foam often used when designing an arrangement. They might use it to make a wreath or to make a headband for a flower girl, something like that. Paper flower artists and paper plant artists like myself will use it to be, of course, the stem, the main stem of the flower or the plant. It's also used by, of course, different artists and craftspeople for various things. You know, I even just used it recently to do that bridge part over the nose on a mask, you know, for what's going on right now. The good thing about it is that it's made of aluminum, so it's not going to rust. Floral wire comes in two different forms typically. It's going to be straight, which is also called stem wire, or it's going to be on a spool, something like this, this is typically going to be the lighter gauge, and I'll talk about gauge in a second. The most common type of floral wire is going to be coated with paint, like this one I have here, and you'll see this spool is treated the same way. It also can be found coated with paper. There's another type that's called fabric coated, but to me it just looks like it's coated with a wrapping of string really tightly all the way around. For my purposes, my most favorite type is the one that's covered in paper, you know, because I'm making things made out of paper and it's nice to have that cohesive look. And also it has a little bit of a better grip. It's not as, you know, slick as the painted kind, and so glue and things like that are sticking to it better. The most common type of straight floral wire is going to be sold in 14 or 16-inch lengths. I have seen it up to 36, but that's a little less common. And it's going to be sold in gauges of 16 gauge up to like 32. And when you get above 26, something like that, it's typically always going to be on a spool. And the most important thing to remember about gauges is that the lower the gauge, the thicker the wire. And the higher the gauge, the thinner the wire, or the more malleable and bendable it is. In my work, the most often I'm using 16, 18, 20, 22, and sometimes 24 or 26. Anything above that is not going to have much strength to hold up any of the paper leaves or paper flowers or anything like that. Occasionally I will use the lighter gauge if I know that my plant is just a vine and it doesn't need to stand up and it can drape down the side of a pot. Another thing you might want to consider when you're trying to choose the right gauge for your project is if you know at the end of the day you want it to be straight, the wire to be straight, the stem to be straight, it's better practice to go ahead and choose a straight wire, because getting something that's already curved, you know, either in a spool or a paddle, is going to be more difficult to get that really straight at the end. One thing you can do when you're first getting started working with floral wire and you're trying to remember the business about the gauge or where you bought something or the length that it's sold in is each time you get a new package of wire from a different seller or you're encountering a different gauge, go ahead and take a sample of it and just add a tag or glue it to an index card or something like that, and just go ahead and write down where you bought it, what the gauge is. That way when you figure out what your favorite wire to work with, it's not a guessing game of where it came from. So the other wire that I work with that's on my table here, and it's not typically used by floral designers, and it's called armature wire. Armature wire is also aluminum, and it's also pretty malleable. Not typically sold by gauge, it's typically sold by dimension. So this one is probably 1/8 inch, whereas something like this is going to be 1/4 inch. And really I enjoy working with this stuff because if I'm making a plant with a fatter stem or a trunk or something, I'm going to want to start with a thicker wire so that it's just a little bit more easy to make a thicker stem. Of course, at a Michael's or some other craft store, something like that, you're also probably going to encounter Oasis Wire, which is a lighter gauge wire. It's pretty malleable, covered in paper, which is going to be okay for some craft projects, but it's really super flexible, so you're not going to use it to make anything stand up. You're probably going to use it to connect things together. This one I really like. You also might encounter wire that's covered in paper or raffia, something like that, and either of these are great, again, for attaching things together. Or this one actually is a thicker gauge and would probably work for the stem of a plant, but you are going to have a more difficult time gluing things to this kind of substance. But I like both of these as well. To work with any of these wires, you're going to need some sort of wire cutters. So I have 3 different types here on my desk. And all of these kinds of things are going to work, and I'll show you the pros and cons of each of them. So this one is a little bit heavier duty, it has longer blades, and this I'm really going to use if once I've attached multiple wires together and I've got a big bundle or something and I'm going to try to cut through it. You need something a little more heavy duty, but this one doesn't have a spring, so each time you use it, you have to open it up. So if you're cutting a lot, making lots of cuts, I sort of hold it like this so that I can use that finger to open and close it. Both of these types have a different kind of spring. So if you're making lots of cuts, it's nice that it goes ahead and opens for you, and it's going to be the same with this one. Now, the one thing you will notice about wire cutters, pretty much every brand of wire cutter I have ever encountered, unlike scissors where sometimes the sharpest point is way down at where the blades meet, that's not true for wire cutters. And this particular brand, it's really obvious. The blades cross down at the bottom. There's not actually any cutting surface. So you don't want to put your wire all the way down to that point because you're not going to be able to cut it. I see people making that assumption a lot. So you want to be sure that you're putting the wire in the middle of the blade there. The other thing I want to talk about when cutting wire is you want to get into the habit of holding both sides of where you're cutting. And typically I do that by just holding my hand like this. And then of course, so when you cut, one side isn't flying off. So I'll show you what happens if I'm not holding on to both sides. There it goes! So it just means lots of cleanup later, and then you're looking for the rest of your wire. When you think about what you're going to use your wire for, a lot of times even in a single project you could use the same colored wire, but maybe you're using different gauges. You know how vines send off those like curlicue, I'm not sure what they're called, those like curlicue things that they attach on to something with? So I might mimic that with wire. And of course I want to use a higher number, a higher gauge, because that's going to be a thinner wire. And one of these right here, I think this one is 26. So that might be a good one I would use to make something like that. And in that case, it's pretty easy to wrap it quickly around a pencil or the end of a paintbrush or something like that to make one of those curlicues. But I wouldn't use this 26 gauge for the support of my paper plant. It also could be that you're looking for a specific color, and you see here I have this dark green, and I have light green, and I have red, and there's brown in here. Sometimes they're not as easy to find because these things are made in different countries, but I want to remind everyone to check out my last video, which was the floral tape video, because you can't easily cover any of these wires with a layer of floral tape that is sold in almost every color. So go ahead and check out that video too. So in the description I'm gonna give you some links to my favorite vendors for floral wire so you can find your favorites too. Okay, happy making, guys. I hope this was useful for you. Thanks for joining me, and come back. Bye.